stressed the other day, these meetings are not optional, these are not if we want to, it's something that we have to do because it's part of our accreditation process, and it's part of who we are, and we have to achieve this kind of stuff. And in order for the accreditation process to work like it's supposed to, everyone has to be involved. So, I think the committee chairman, they're making their meetings well enough advanced, hopefully, at different times of the day, variations of that to accommodate everyone. But you need to make it a priority to attend these meetings. Hopefully, there won't be that many of them because we want to be done by mid to last February. But you do need this in, and I'll be checking every time. So you need to make it a point. Since things are trying to be worked out for you that you're at these meetings. Okay, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Heather Weldon. Some of you may have seen this today. Next year, Georgia is going to be full swing into a teacher evaluation process called TKES, Teacher Keys Evaluation System on board. I had the chance to spend 4 days with Dr. Weldon this summer. Going through the process, to do it, and she is now here with us to give you an overview of what the new evaluation system is going to be like. A lot of myths, a lot of things floating out there about what an outcome the results of this evaluation system is going to be. Over the next year, she is our lead go-to person. She'll be in our schools or at the schools with us, going through things, and as we come up with questions or concerns, she'll be able to answer. There are 5 of you in here going through the pilot program. Ms. Fab, or Ms. Easley now, Mr. Floyd, Ms. Kessler, Ms. Molesky, and Ms. Exton. She's not here. So the 5 of them are going through this initial pilot stage. Today, Ms. Kessler had actually, the time that the group was coming was at 1:30. Seeing how she's the only one with class at 1:30, she got involved in, and so she had a 30-minute visit today. We appreciate it. It was good. Everybody had good things to say, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on. I know Dr. Bilton will stop in after it in a good way. So I know you were very scared today, and we appreciate that. So, Dr. Bilton, I'll let you have it, and I'm talking about you.
We really do appreciate Ms. Kessler letting us come in today and do that observation. You all can imagine having 6 or 7 people stream into your room the week before the holiday. That is not what anybody wants to have happen. So, again, we really appreciate that. We've been in 8 schools across Effingham yesterday and today, and so there's been a lot of teachers just really helping us out. But I do appreciate also that you're here today. I know again that it's after school and it's a very busy week. When I go through this presentation, I do tend to go fast, and most people are like, good, just keep going. But if at any given time I'm going too fast and you're missing stuff, just tell me, slow down. I'll stay at the end, and if you have specific questions that are about what you're teaching or misconceptions that you've heard or questions that you've heard from other districts, just let me know, and I'll be happy to stay to answer your questions. This is the model that you'll always see for the Teacher Keys Effectiveness System. There are 3 components, and we're going to talk about some new acronyms. You'll see at the very top it says the Teacher Keys Effectiveness System. You'll hear it sometimes referred to as Teacher Keys, TKES, probably a lot of other things we don't want to know. But it generates a teacher effectiveness measure known as a TEM, TEM. So you'll hear about a TEM. That is what all of those 3 components below work together to generate. The first component is the Teacher Assessment on Performance Standards, which is also known as the TAPS, and that is the observations based on the 10 standards. The Surveys of Instructional Practice is the second component, and the bottom component is the Student Growth and Academic Achievement component. We're going to spend most of our time today looking at the TAPS component, the Teacher Assessment on Performance Standards. I'm going to briefly go over the surveys and how the surveys lead into the rating on the TAPS, and then spend very, very little time on the bottom component because you'll be getting a lot more training in that later. To generate a TEM, it is a 50-50 split. The surveys don't hold any rating of their own or any percentage of the rating. The rating for the 10 is calculated from the overall TAPS, and we'll talk about that, and then 50% on the student growth piece. So that's how they generate the 10. Obviously, the key, most important part of the Teacher Keys effectiveness system is to optimize student learning. So everything we do when we're looking at teacher effectiveness, because we know nothing matters more to student achievement than the quality of the teacher in the classroom. Just a brief little background of information, and I noticed when I was looking at slides earlier, I must be running off a different PowerPoint system because some of my slides have funky things going on, so I'll apologize for that and just kind of tell you what was there, even though it may not be there. You probably have heard of Race to the Top, or RT3. There were 26 districts that were part of Race to the Top in the state of Georgia. They were the initial pilot folks out there that really have sorted a lot of the kinks out of the process for you all. So there were 26 districts, Race to the Top. They piloted the initial tax component. They were without the electronic platform during the initial part of 2011 and 12. In 2012 and 13, Cohort 1 went full implementation. Those 26 districts have been fully implementing Teacher Keys. And we picked up about another 30 districts that we consider Cohort 2 districts. Most of those districts are in full implementation this year with Cohort 1. And then you all are part of what we call Cohort 3. You are piloting you've got in Effingham, you've got a 5-teacher per school pilot, preparing to be fully implementing next year. So across the state, we have about 50 districts in full implementation, and the rest of the districts that are in different modes of the pilot implementation. There are also districts of higher ed that have joined in the training of Teacher Keys. This was the great map of Georgia, which has disappeared somehow however, my joke is plugged in. But if you can imagine the state of Georgia up there, there are about 190 districts. So, and so we've got counties and school districts. So we have more school districts than we have counties. You would see the 26 green and the 30 that are in purple, and then you would see almost the entire rest of the state is in blue. Almost all of the state is in some form of implementing Teacher Keys, whether they're in the pilot or they're in full implementation. Most of that came about, the huge increase came about because of House Bill 244. In the spring, the Georgia legislation passed House Bill 244, which mandates the use of a single statewide evaluation system for teachers and leaders. So teachers and principals and assistant principals will have the same evaluation system in full implementation in 14-15. Effingham was very forward-thinking in making sure that they got into the pilot. We piloted a small number, but they're working very hard at the district level to make sure that all teachers understand what is coming in 14-15. This is really the year to help teachers understand the 10 standards, to have those conversations about the expectations of the standards, and really be ready for full implementation in 14-15. That's why we're using the holiday week to make sure you've got that information, because when we come back and we're rolling into February, we're going to be starting to work on the student achievement piece. So we wanted to make sure there was an overview there. The other part of House Bill 244 is it requires multiple observations. We'll talk about that with the walkthroughs and formative observations. Student achievement contributes 50% to the overall 10 calculation. And contracts must be offered by May 15th. There's been waivers allowing school districts to offer contracts as late as May 15th, but House Bill 244 puts that into place. House Bill 244 also says that any feedback on observations, walkthroughs, or formatives must be given to a teacher within 5 working days. So anytime an evaluator comes in and does a walkthrough or an observation, they have 5 days to give you feedback on that observation. And that comes through the electronic platform. That does not mean there is a conference. There's not a conference for all the walkthroughs and the observations, but you do get feedback, the rating and commentary through the electronic platform within 5 days. House Bill 244 says that if a teacher wants a conference, after they get the rating, they can request a conference within 10 working days, and that conference must be held within 10 working days. So although there's not a conference attached to each one of the times that somebody's coming into your classroom, you can request a conference within 10 days anytime you get a rating. The evaluations yield specific ratings. They're either ineffective, needs development, proficient, or exemplary. Evaluators must be trained before they can go in and evaluate, and they must pass a credentialing, so they must be credentialed. As Mr. Hughes spoke about, we were together for just Teacher Keys for 3 days, and then they go through a 2.5 to 3 hour credentialing exam that they have to pass with an 80, et cetera, to actually be credentialed to go out. And then we do lots of inter-rater reliability things, which is what we started doing today. All components of a teacher's evaluation are confidential. So although we will be moving everyone from paper pencil things down at the board office, it will be electronically housed in the electronic platform. All parts of that are still confidential. So even though you may have it on the electronic platform, that doesn't mean that colleagues or parents or anybody else can see what goes on in the platform. There's been misconceptions out there about that as well. So you're the only person, along with the evaluator and the district people, the same folks that have access in HR to your personnel record are the same people that have access to the electronic portfolio. Everything that we did in the Teacher Keys and the components, you'll see revolve around what we know is best research on student achievement gains. One of the foundational pieces is the MET report that was funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But what they show is that the 3 most important factors in looking at predicted student achievement gains are multiple observations, which you'll see in the TAPS component, student feedback, which you'll see in the survey component, and prior student academic gains, which is in that final piece. So we're going to spend a quick amount of time on the TAPS component. This is what the overview looks like. For each one of the standards, there is for the component, for the very beginning, the overall, there are 5 domains and there are 10 standards. So for every domain, there are 2 standards. If you look at your yellow card, you will see your standards. Underneath the standards, there are performance indicators. Those are samples of behaviors that might be seen in the classroom that would show proficiency in that standard. One of the misconceptions that was out there, particularly during cohort 1, is that it was expected that teachers show all of those indicators when someone was coming in to do an evaluation. There is no expectation that someone would see all of those indicators. The indicators are there to help you as a teacher and as the evaluator understand the standard in more depth. There are many more things that could be added as indicators for each one of those standards. But the indicators are just there to help you. They are samples of behaviors that might be seen. So you're not expected to see, we train that they are not a checklist. It's not 1.1, 1.2, and somebody's coming in to say, I see 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. You're always evaluated at the standard level. The other card that you have is a blue card. That's the rubric card. The rubric that we use is a performance appraisal rubric. There is a rubric for each standard. You will notice that the language of the standard is the language of proficient in the performance appraisal rubric. So when it says the teacher promotes student learning, etc., you'll see that same verbiage in what you see under proficient. So the expected level of performance in Teacher Keys is proficient. That kind of gives people sometimes an ulcer, because what do teachers want? They want exemplary. Exemplary, when we look at the rubric, exemplary is consistently performing at the proficient level and additional behaviors that you would see under exemplary. Many times when I'm in schools, teachers will ask me, how do I move from proficient to exemplary? Well, the best thing I can say is direct you back to the verbiage that is in the standard, because there's behaviors that are in the standard. It's more than being proficient consistently, because being proficient consistently is proficient. Exemplary is a whole different level. We've had, and you guys have been using GTEP for several years. In GTEP, we've had unsat and sat. That's all you had. You had unsatisfactory and satisfactory. So you had teachers that were out of this world, fantastic teachers that were getting satisfactory. And then we had a group of teachers that were just barely making it out of unsat, and they were getting the same level of satisfactory as the person that was really working and really should have been exemplary. So you can kind of think of that satisfactory part in GTEP being broken down into 3 categories. So now we have satisfactory, could be needs development, could be proficient, and could be exemplary. So they've taken it and pulled those pieces apart. Sometimes that helps with the understanding. Again, these are the 5 domains and the 10 standards. We're going to quickly go through the 10 standards to make sure that you have a beginning level of understanding. You will spend more time. You probably have already started spending time looking at those standards. They start flowing when you start looking at them. They flow, and I guarantee you, when you hear them, you won't say, oh my goodness, where did they come up with that? Because that's something that we never do in the classroom. Most of the time when teachers hear the 10 standards, they realize these are things that effective teachers do every day, all the time. Standard 1 is the professional knowledge. The teacher demonstrates an understanding of the curriculum, content, pedagogical knowledge, and the needs of the students by providing relevant learning experiences. This is the background knowledge that the teacher brings in the classroom. You can't teach content that you don't know. So this is the foundational piece in Standard 1. Standard 2 follows right along with it with instructional planning. The teacher plans using the appropriate curriculum, effective strategies, resources, and data, and you start seeing the differentiated. There is a standard all about differentiated, but this standard talks about planning and planning for the different levels in the classroom. So we have the background knowledge, we have instructional planning, which falls right into the instructional strategies, the strategies that the teacher uses that are research-based and relevant to the content area to engage students in active learning and promote key skills. So we have the planning, the content knowledge, the planning, and then the strategies. These are things that you're hearing very frequently with the Common Core. It's the same verbiage. The Common Core is part of what effective teachers do, which leads into differentiated instruction, about the teacher challenging and supporting with appropriate content the individual learning differences. Across the state, this is the one standard that probably, well, it hasn't probably, has created the most discussion. There's a lot of discussion about what differentiated instruction is all about. Over the last 2 days when we've been in many of the schools in Effingham, we've had a lot of great dialogue. It's the same dialogue that you all will want to have as a faculty about what is differentiated instruction. What does it look like? There are some indicators there to start helping you think through it. There are fact sheets that you have available on all the standards. But you'll also want to have conversation about what are other things. So if I'm in a classroom as a teacher, and I have different questioning techniques for the different groups of kids in my classroom, that might not mean that I have small groups going on all the time, but my questioning strategies might be differentiated. There's a lot of different ways that you differentiate. Sometimes you differentiate on the spot. I walk around and I see that a student has a misconception and I reteach it to that student at that time. I'm differentiating for that student at that moment based on my informal assessment of what's going on. So there's a lot of things that you probably are already doing that you're not thinking about. So you'll want to have that dialogue with each other. That's the most powerful part of anything that I've seen with Teacher Keys, is the dialogue that teachers have about best practice and about effective teaching and really moving student achievement along. The next standard and the sixth standard as well are all about assessment. We've learned a lot about assessment in the last, say, 5 or 6 years. When I was in college 25 years ago, we didn't know a lot about assessment. We had our unit, we wrote a test at the end of it where we took the test out of the back of the book. We didn't know what we know today. So these two standards really look at best practice and assessment. Standard 5 is about assessment strategies, how the teacher systematically chooses a variety of diagnostic, formative, and summative assessment strategies and instruments that are valid and appropriate. So again, for example, when you all were in college, you may have had the experience where you studied and studied and studied all of your notes, and then you went in to take the test, and you thought, where did that come from? Because the test wasn't aligned to the content that was being taught. So this standard addresses those kind of things. Is there alignment between the standard and the assessment? Is the assessment valid? And is the assessment measuring at the depth of knowledge that we expect that standard to be achieved? So there's a lot of things that we look at in here. Informal assessments, how you informally assess your students and how you formally assess your students. Some of you use tickets out the door, exit tickets, etc. Some of you walk around with a notepad and checklist, or you do multiple different things that you're already doing that are part of assessment strategies. Following that is standard 6 on assessment uses. What do you do with that data once you get it? So you're assessing your students all along. This talks about how you gather it, analyze it, and use it to guide your instructional practices. So once you've been getting all that data in, now what do I do with it? That makes a difference for the students in my classroom. So you can see how the standards kind of flow. And again, they're probably things that you think we're already doing that, and I bet you probably are. Standards 7 and 8 are about the learning environment, but they are two very different standards. Standard 7, the positive learning environment, is about that caring, warm, inviting environment that teachers create of mutual respect, where there's procedures and routines in place, it's safe. Standard 8 is different than that. Standard 8 is about the academically challenging environment. This is the environment where there's high expectations of all. This is where you're looked at for pacing and the use of time, and that all students are expected to achieve at high levels. This is the rigor standard. When we talk about rigor, it comes into Standard 8. So if you have students that come in here, here, and here, all 3 of those, or all 6 of those levels, whatever you have, are all challenged academically. Your up here kids aren't just expected to tutor the down here kids. The kids up here are also expected to be moving at the same level. Standard 9 is the standard on professionalism. Standard 9 takes the place of the GTDRI. There is not a GTDRI in teacher keys. Everything about FERPA and privacy issues, showing up to your duty station, doing all of those things is part of Standard 9. But Standard 9 has 2 different pieces. Part of it is about the professionalism, etc. But the second part of Standard 9 is about professional growth. It's about, as a teacher, how willing are you to attend professional learning opportunities, and how well do you take that and implement it into the classroom. We know that in 2013, almost 2014, you cannot be an educator and not be a professional learner. Things are moving too fast. Technology's coming in. Our students are different than they were 10 years ago. We've got to always be learning to be ready to present that material in an engaging, relevant way to our students. So this standard talks about the professionalism in both ways. The final standard is Standard 10, which is on communication, about how the teacher communicates effectively with all stakeholders, students, parents, the community, etc. And that could be whether, depending on your age level and depending on the area in which you teach, whether you do a lot of that electronically or whether you do it in paper newsletters still, but that is the standard that really looks at your ability to communicate. So hopefully when you hear those 10 standards, you don't see them or hear them as something else on your plate, because they shouldn't be something else on your plate. They should simply be a framework for what you're already doing. So you may call it something different, but it probably, you'll be able to see the connection of what you're doing. When you're working on implementing the Common Core, you're meeting these standards. You're doing things that are in the standards. When you're doing data team, you're doing things that are part of these standards. The standards aren't something separate. Everything that you're doing falls under the standards. So hopefully that helps alleviate some of the, oh my goodness, we have to do something new. Because I know there's about 800,000 new things out there right now to learn. There will be some new language, but most of it you'll find is exactly the same things that effective teachers do. Again, you have your blue card, which is the performance appraisal rubric. You'll see terms that are frequently shown under particular standards. Anytime you see deficient, you'll see the word consistently in the rubric. But the rubric is a behavioral summary scale, so it's very clear on what the behaviors are. Again, the standard is exactly what you'll see in the proficient level of the rubric. I'm going to quickly go through what goes on over the course of the year in the TAPS flow, which is that first component. You start with an orientation and familiarization. The orientation is very similar to what we're doing today. It's making sure that you understand the process. Familiarization happens all during the course of the year, next year, etc., where you're learning more about the standards. And then you do a self-assessment at the beginning of the year on yourself, where you reflect on where you feel that you are on the standards. Your reflection doesn't hold any rating at all. Your reflection is just your self-reflection. It gives your evaluator some understanding of where you see yourself. And then you have a pre-evaluation conference. There are 3 conferences held during the course of the year. The conferences are not attached to those observations. They are separate, and we'll go in a little bit more on the pre-evaluation conference. This is the formative assessment cycle. This is where the walkthroughs and the formative observations are, and then you get to the summative. Everything that happens during this part of the year with those 4 walkthroughs and 2 formatives are formative in nature. They don't hold a rating per se in the platform. They are there to give you ongoing feedback during the course of the year. So if you get a needs development in a walkthrough, you have a needs development in a walkthrough, that's all. It gives you feedback on areas that you need to grow. It isn't until the summative that anything actually holds a rating in the platform. The pre-evaluation conference is done before any of the walkthroughs or formative observations are started, and they can be done as a group or they can be done individually. That is an administration decision. Administrator decides whether or not they want to do it with a single person or with a group. For example, the principal might decide to do it with the math department or with the 2nd grade team. So it's completely up to the principal. It utilizes data from the self-assessment. It addresses goals and expectations of teacher keys, and it's always recorded in the electronic platform. We'll talk a little bit about the electronic platform at the very end, but everything that you do with teacher keys all happens on the electronic platform. So this is an overview of the flow. We're going to talk mainly about what happens during this formative cycle and then at the summative cycle. So during the formative cycle, there are a minimum of 4 walkthroughs, 10 minutes each, focused on a few standards. Typically, we say 2 to 4 standards in a walkthrough. It could be more than that if an evaluator comes in and sees lots of things going on that they could rate during that time, but typically it's about 2 to 4, and it's a minimum of 10 minutes. The evaluator can stay longer, and the evaluator can do 16 walkthroughs if they choose, but they do have to do a minimum of 4 during the year and a minimum of 2 30-minute observations during the year. Those 30-minute observations are different than what you get with a G-toy, but it is 30 minutes in the classroom for a minimum, and they are done twice a year. There was also a misconception out there about what we call documentation. Typically, the only time documentation would be requested from a teacher would be if there was more information needed to rate a standard. So, for example, you all do lots of things with communication, but if I'm going to rate you and I'm not sure about all the different things that you do, I may ask, can I see a copy of your newsletter, or can I see your contact log? You all use Infinite Campus, and a lot of that's already housed in Infinite Campus. You already have some mechanism that you turn in lesson plans. The electronic platform isn't the place where you're now uploading lesson plans, uploading stuff from Infinite Campus. The misconception was that teachers were required to create portfolios. There is no expectation from the Department of Ed that teachers are creating portfolios. How we train is that evaluators access all of the things that they already have in place to look for that. So there's already a place where you put your student grades in Infinite Campus. That's supposed to be updated at a certain time. It doesn't need to go on the platform because the evaluator can already access it. The evaluator can access lesson plans, discipline logs, all of those things. If you're asked to submit something, then that would be something that the evaluator doesn't have access to and needs more clarification before they rate that standard. In House Bill 244, it says that a teacher can submit documentation to be looked at as it relates to a standard at any time from the pre-conference to the summative conference. So if you wanted to submit other documentation, you are free to do that. We highly recommend that if it's something that your administrator already has access to, that you don't spend your time doing that, because you have other more important things to do than just uploading things onto the electronic platform. The formative assessment cycle, when we talked about that formative observation of 30 minutes, it's not the same as your G-toy observation, where the evaluator comes in, as is going on this year, and they see you for 30 minutes, and then they give you a rating on what they see, and you get feedback based on that 30 minutes of the G-toy. That observation goes in with the walkthroughs and all the other documentation, which could be lesson plans, it could be student data from Infinite Campus, it could be from CCRPI, from a lot of different areas that you already have in place. All of that is taken into consideration when you're rated on all 10 standards, and you're rated on all 10 standards twice a year. So twice a year, formatively, you're going to get feedback based on how well you're doing on all 10 standards. Again, it's formative in nature. It is just there for growth. Teacher Keys is a growth model, so you're going to get that feedback based on that information. The scale disappeared when I plugged in over there. So just pretend that there's a scale. The formative observation of 30 minutes is not equal to the formative assessment. The formative observation is just one piece of that. The formative, well, that's funny, the scale is, was the map over there earlier? No, okay, but the scale is, okay, it's just not over there. So the formative assessment takes into account all of the pieces. So when you get the formative assessment, know that they're not just going in from that 30 minutes, even though they have to give you feedback. You have that 30-minute observation, you have to get feedback within 5 days. But you're going to get information based on more than just that 30 minutes that the evaluator was in the room. When they're rating you, they're looking at the big picture. So most teachers feel very good about that because it's honoring what you do more than in a 30-minute snapshot. It's taking into account all the things that you're doing with advanced ed this year. It's taking into account all the external things that you do with supporting your students and the parents that you teach, the parents and the students that you teach. In the middle of the year, you have a mid-year evaluation conference. There was a pre-evaluation conference at the beginning of the year, and then the mid-year evaluation conference that's usually held in December or January. It can again be held individually or with groups of teachers. Typically, if they're with groups, it's grade-alike groups or content-alike groups, and you're looking a lot at student progress. So this is a conference that's very much focused on student data. You probably already do something very similar to a mid-year conference already. It's just documented in the platform that you all had a mid-year conference that was focused on the student data. The next area that we're going to look at before we talk about the summative is the surveys of instructional practice. The surveys of instructional practice on the model you will always see with an arrow because the surveys do not hold a rating of their own. They are a piece of documentation. So when we talk about this being a 50-50 split as it relates to the 10, this is a piece of documentation that feeds into that. In the original model, it did hold a percentage of its own. After the initial pilot, it was determined that from mass feedback that it wasn't going to hold a rating of its own. And you will see that there are grades 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12 surveys. Again, it's a piece of data that helps the administrator or the evaluator as they're doing the rating. So it's just a piece of the total picture. There are 3 different surveys based on developmentally appropriate language. There are not surveys for pre-K through 2nd grade. There's not validity and reliability for those surveys, but there is a lot of validity and reliability of using student perception surveys in grades 3 through 12. And it's important to remember that they are perception surveys. It's what the kids perceive is going on in the classroom as it relates to 4 of the standards. All of the surveys are done on the electronic platform. The kids get a username and a password that can be used one time. So after they go in one time, they can't take that username and password home and go in and do 67 other surveys. There's no place for comments. It's strictly they go in and they do the rating. We'll look at some sample questions. And it's administered anytime from October till the end of April. And again, they are anonymous. The questions are focused on standards 3, 4, 7, and 8. So the questions are focused on instructional strategies, differentiated instruction, positive learning environment, and the academically challenging environment. So that is what we're pulling perception data from. And you guys are in Effingham, you're very close to Savannah. You probably see the Savannah Morning News. Savannah was an RT3 district. They were one of the first 26. About a year and a half ago, there was a front page paper that said teachers will no longer give homework and because students will determine teachers' pay. And it was a whole article that didn't have one sentence in it that was correct, but it went back to the surveys. Students don't rate teachers. Administrators rate teachers. Students give perception data on 4 standards that is used as a piece of data for the evaluator when they're rating on all 4 standards. Does that make sense? Students don't rate teachers. but they get perception data on 4 standards. You have open access to what the questions look like on the platform. Your colleagues and your administrator, all of that's there. So you can see it. As 15 students take the survey, the mean scores roll up in the platform. 15 is the in size for anonymity. And so you can start seeing as kids take the survey what their perception is, what's going on in the classroom. Now, if they rate a teacher whichever way, that again is just information for the administrator. These are some example questions. You'll see the scale. It's a Likert scale. The scale for the 3-5 survey is a 0 to 2 scale. The 6 through 12 survey is a 0 to 3 scale. These scales do not mean ineffective, needs development, proficient, or exemplary. They're 2 totally different scales that do not overlap. And when we train administrators, we train that as well. These do not overlap, but they give you perception data from students. For you all as teachers, it's very helpful data to know whether or not the students feel like the instructional strategies are whatever. And you'll see from the questions, it's not going to use the term instructional strategies. It's going to ask them about is there different activities that you get to do, et cetera. And you will have the opportunity to look at those. Again, it will roll up into mean scores. You'll get the mean score on the platform at the end of the survey window, the end of April, usually by the beginning of May. You'll also be able to see the mean score for your district, the mean score for the state, and the standard deviation. So you'll be able to get lots of information that will help you when you analyze your student perception data. It's just as much for you as the teacher as it is for the evaluator, because it gives you a great deal of feedback. From the research, we know that students do a better job of predicting achievement than evaluators do of predicting achievement. So when they've looked at student surveys of perception, they tend to have a higher degree of accuracy on how well the class is going to perform than evaluators going into the classroom, which is why US Ed made sure that on that model, that survey piece was still out there, and it's still 3 components, even though that survey component doesn't hold a